Section 4 of When God Laughs by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Section 4 Just Meat. He strolled to the corner and glanced up and down the intersecting street, but saw nothing save the oases of light shed by the street lamps at the successive crossings. Then he strolled back the way he had come. He was a shadow of a man, sliding noiselessly and without undue movement through the semi-darkness. Also, he was very alert, like a wild animal in the jungle, keenly perceptive and receptive. The movement of another in the darkness about him would need to have been more shadowy than he to have escaped him. In addition to the running advertisement of the state of affairs carried to him by his senses, he had a subtler perception, a feel of the atmosphere around him. He knew that the house in front of which he paused for a moment contained children, yet by no willed effort of perception did he have this knowledge. For that matter, he was not even aware that he knew, so occult was the impression. Yet did a moment arise in which action in relation to that house were imperative, he would have acted on the assumption that it contained children. He was not aware of all that he knew about the neighborhood. In the same way, he knew not how, he knew that no danger threatened in the footfalls that came up the cross street. Before he saw the walker, he knew him for a belated pedestrian hurrying home. The walker came into view at the crossing and disappeared on up the street. The man that watched noted a light that flared up in the window of a house on the corner, and as it died down he knew it for an expiring match. This was conscious identification of familiar phenomena, and through his mind flitted the thought, wanted to know what time. In another house, one room was lighted. The light burned dimly and steadily, and he had the feel that it was a sick room. He was especially interested in a house across the street in the middle of the block. To this house he paid most attention. No matter what way he looked, nor what way he walked, his looks and his steps always returned to it. Except for an open window above the porch, there was nothing unusual about the house. Nothing came in or out. Nothing happened. There were no lighted windows, nor had lights appeared and disappeared in any of the windows. Yet it was the central point of his consideration. He rallied to it each time after a divination of the state of the neighborhood. Despite his feel of things, he was not confident. He was supremely conscious of the precariousness of his situation. Though unperturbed by the footfalls of the chance pedestrian, he was as keyed up and sensitive and ready to be startled as any timorous deer. He was aware of the possibility of other intelligences prowling about in the darkness, intelligences similar to his own in movement, perception, and divination. Far down the street he caught a glimpse of something that moved, and he knew it was no late home-goer, but menace and danger. He whistled twice to the house across the street, then faded away shadow-like to the corner and around the corner. Here he paused and looked about him carefully. Reassured, he peered back around the corner and studied the object that moved and that was coming nearer. He had divined aright. It was a policeman. The man went down the cross street to the next corner, from the shelter of which he watched the corner he had just left. He saw the policeman pass by, going straight on up the street. He paralleled the policeman's course, and from the next corner again watched him go by. Then he returned the way he had come. He whistled once to the house across the street, and after a time whistled once again. There was reassurance in the whistle, just as there had been warning in the previous double whistle. He saw a dark bulk outline itself on the roof of the porch and slowly descend a pillar. Then it came down the steps, passing through the small iron gate, and went down the sidewalk, taking on the form of a man. He that watched kept on his own side of the street, and moved on abreast to the corner, where he crossed over and joined the other. He was quite small alongside the man he accosted.
"How'd you make out, Matt?"
he asked. The other grunted indistinctly and walked on in silence a few steps. "I reckon I landed the goods," he said. Jim chuckled in the darkness and waited for further information. The blocks passed by under their feet, and he grew impatient.
"Well, how about them goods?" he asked. "What kind of a haul did you make, anyway?"
"I was too busy to figure it out.
But it's fat, I can tell you that much, Jim. It's fat. I don't dast to think how fat it is. Wait till we get to the room." Jim looked at him keenly under the street lamp of the next crossing, and saw that his face was a trifle grim, and that he carried his left arm peculiarly.
"What's the matter with your arm?" he demanded.
"The little cuss bit me. I hope I don't get hydrophoby. Folks gets hydrophoby from man bites sometimes, don't they?"
"Gave you fight, eh?"
Jim asked encouragingly. The other grunted.
"You're harder'n hell to get information from,"
Jim burst out irritably.
"Tell us about it. You ain't goin' to lose money just a tellin' a guy."
"I guess I choked him some," came the answer. Then, by way of explanation, "He woke up on me."
"You did it neat. I never heard a sound."
"Jim," the other said with seriousness, "it's a hangin' matter. I fixed him. I had to. He woke up on me. You and me's got to do some layin' low for a spell." Jim gave a low whistle of comprehension.
"Did you hear me whistle?" he asked suddenly.
"Sure. I was all done. I was just comin' out."
"It was a bull, but he wasn't on a little bit. Went right by and kept a paddlin' the hoof out of sight. Then I come back and gave you the whistle. What made you take so long after that?"
"I was waitin' to make sure," Matt explained. "I was mighty glad when I heard you whistle again. It's hard work, waitin'. I just sat there and thought and thought. Oh, all kinds of things. It's remarkable what a fellow'll think about. And then there was a darn cat that kept movin' around the house, all botherin' me with its noises."
"And it's fat!"
Jim exclaimed irrelevantly with joy. "I'm sure tellin' you, Jim, it's fat. I'm plumb anxious for another look at 'em." Unconsciously the two men quickened their pace, yet they did not relax from their caution. Twice they changed their course in order to avoid policemen, and they made very sure that they were not observed when they dived into the dark hallway of a cheap rooming house downtown. Not until they had gained their own room on the top floor did they scratch a match. While Jim lighted a lamp, Matt locked the door and threw the bolts into place. As he turned, he noticed that his partner was waiting expectantly. Matt smiled to himself at the other's eagerness. "Them searchlights is all right," he said, drawing forth a small pocket electric lamp and examining it. "But we gotta get a new battery. It's runnin' pretty weak. I thought once or twice it'd leave me in the dark. Funny arrangements in that house. I near got lost. His room was on the left, and that fooled me some."
"I told you it was on the left," Jim interrupted.
"You told me it was on the right," Matt went on. "I guess I know what you told me. And there's the map you drew." Fumbling in his vest pocket, he drew out a folded slip of paper. As he unfolded it, Jim bent over and looked.
"I did make a mistake," he confessed.
"You sure did. It got me guessin' some for a while."
"But it don't matter now," Jim cried. "Let's see what you got."
"It does matter," Matt retorted. "It matters a lot to me. I've got to run all the risk. I put my head in the trap while you stay on the street. You got to get on to yourself and be more careful. All right, I'll show you." He dipped loosely into his trousers pocket and brought out a handful of small diamonds. He spilled them out in a blazing stream on the greasy table. Jim let out a great oath. "That's nothing," Matt said with triumphant complacence. "I ain't begun yet." From one pocket after another he continued bringing forth the spoil. There were many diamonds wrapped in chamois skin that were larger than those in the first handful. From one pocket he brought out a handful of very small cut gems. "Sun dust," he remarked as he spilled them on the table in a space by themselves. Jim examined them.
"Just the same, they retail for a couple of dollars each," he said. "Is that all?"
"Ain't it enough?" the other demanded in an aggrieved tone.
"Sure it is," Jim answered with unqualified approval. "Better'n I expected. I wouldn't take a cent less than 10,000 for the bunch."
10,000? Matt sneered. "They're worth twice that, and I don't know anything about jewelry either. Look at that big boy." He picked it out from the sparkling heap and held it near to the lamp with the air of an expert weighing and judging.
"Worth 1,000 all by its lonely," was Jim's quicker judgment.
1,000 your grandmother," was Matt's scornful rejoinder. "You couldn't buy it for 3."
"Wake me up. I'm dreamin'."
The sparkle of the gems was in Jim's eyes, and he began sorting out the larger diamonds and examining them.
"We're rich men, Matt. We'll be regular swells."
"It'll take years to get rid of 'em," was Matt's more practical thought.
"But think how we'll live. Nothin' to do but spend the money and go on gettin' rid of them."
Matt's eyes were beginning to sparkle, though somberly, as his phlegmatic nature woke up.
"I told you I didn't dast think how fat it was,"
he murmured in a low voice.
"What a killin'! What a killin'!"
was the other's more ecstatic utterance.
"Almost forgot,"
Matt said, thrusting his hand into his inside coat pocket. A string of large pearls emerged from wrappings of tissue paper and chamois skin. Jim scarcely glanced at them.
"They're worth money,"
he said, and returned to the diamonds. A silence fell on the two men, Jim playing with the gems, running them through his fingers, sorting them into piles, and spreading them out flat and wide. He was a slender, weazened man, nervous, irritable, high-strung, and anemic, a typical child of the gutter, with unbeautiful, twisted features, small-eyed, with face and mouth perpetually and feverishly hungry, brutish in a cat-like way, stamped to the core with degeneracy. Matt did not finger the diamonds. He sat with chin on hands and elbows on table, blinking heavily at the blazing array. He was in every way a contrast to the other. No city had bred him. He was heavy-muscled and hairy, gorilla-like in strength and aspect. For him there was no unseen world. His eyes were full and wide apart, and there seemed in them a certain bold brotherliness. They inspired confidence. But a closer inspection would have shown that his eyes were just a trifle too full, just a shade too wide apart. He exceeded, spilled over the limits of normality, and his features told lies about the man beneath.
"The bunch is worth 50,000," Jim remarked suddenly.
100,000,
Matt said. The silence returned and endured a long time, to be broken again by Jim.
"What in hell was he doin' with them all at the house? That's what I want to know. I'd have thought he'd kept 'em in the safe down at the store."
Matt had just been considering the vision of the throttled man as he had last looked upon him in the dim light of the electric lantern, but he did not start at the mention of him.
"There's no tellin'," he answered. "He might have been gettin' ready to chuck his pardner. He might have pulled out in the morning for parts unknown if we hadn't happened along. I guess there's just as many thieves among honest men as there is among thieves. You read about such things in the papers, Jim. Pardners is always knifin' each other."
A queer, nervous look came into the other's eyes. Matt did not betray that he noted it, though he said,
"What was you thinking about, Jim?"
Jim was a trifle awkward for the moment.
"Nothin'," he answered. "Only I was thinkin' just how funny it was, all them jewels at his house. What made you ask?"
"Nothin'. I was just wonderin'. That was all."
The silence settled down, broken by an occasional low and nervous giggle on the part of Jim. He was overcome by the spread of gems. It was not that he felt their beauty. He was unaware that they were beautiful in themselves. But in them his swift imagination visioned the joys of life they would buy, and all the desires and appetites of his diseased mind and sickly flesh were tickled by the promise they extended. He builded wondrous orgy-haunted castles out of their brilliant fires, and was appalled at what he builded. Then it was that he giggled. It was all too impossible to be real, and yet there they blazed on the table before him, fanning the flame of the lust of him, and he giggled again.
"I guess we might as well count 'em,"
Matt said suddenly, tearing himself away from his own visions.
"You watch me and see that it's square, because you and me has got to be on the square, Jim. Understand?"
Jim did not like this, and he betrayed it in his eyes, while Matt did not like what he saw in his partner's eyes.
"Understand?"
Matt repeated, almost menacingly.
"Ain't we always been square?"
the other replied, on the defensive because of the treachery already whispering in him.
"It don't cost nothin' bein' square in hard times," Matt retorted. "It's bein' square in prosperity that counts. When we ain't got nothin', we can't help bein' square. We're prosperous now, and we've got to be businessmen, honest businessmen. Understand?"
"That's the talk for me,"
Jim approved, but deep down in the meagre soul of him, and in spite of him, wanton and lawless thoughts were stirring like chained beasts. Matt stepped to the food shelf behind the 2-burner kerosene cooking stove. He emptied the tea from a paper bag, and from a second bag emptied some red peppers. Returning to the table with the bags, he put into them the 2 sizes of small diamonds. Then he counted the large gems and wrapped them in their tissue paper and chamois skin.
147 good sized ones, was his inventory. 20 real big ones, 2 big boys and 1 whopper, and a couple of fistfuls of teeny ones and dust.
He looked at Jim.
"Correct,"
was the response. He wrote the count out on a slip of memorandum paper and made a copy of it, giving 1 slip to his partner and retaining the other.
"Just for reference," he said.
Again he had recourse to the food shelf, where he emptied the sugar from a large paper bag. Into this he thrust the diamonds, large and small, wrapped it up in a bandana handkerchief, and stowed it away under his pillow. Then he sat down on the edge of the bed and took off his shoes.
"Are you thinking they're worth 100,000?"
Jim asked, pausing and looking up from the unlacing of his shoe.
"Sure," was the answer. "I seen a dance house girl down in Arizona once with some big sparklers on her. It wasn't real. She said if they was, she wouldn't be dancin'. Said they'd be worth all of 50,000, and she didn't have a dozen of 'em all told."
"Who'd work for a living?"
Jim triumphantly demanded.
"Pick and shovel work?" he sneered. "Work like a dog all my life, and save all my wages, and I wouldn't have half as much as we got to night."
"Dishwasher's about your measure, and you couldn't get more'n 20 a month and board. Your figures is way off, but your point is well taken. Let them that likes it work. I rode range for 30 a month when I was young and foolish. Well, I'm older, and I ain't riding range."
He got into bed on one side. Jim put out the light and followed him on the other side.
"How's your arm feel?"
Jim queried amiably. Such a concern was unusual, and Matt noted it and replied,
"I guess there's no danger of hydrophoby. What made you ask?"
Jim felt in himself a guilty stir, and under his breath he cursed the other's way of asking disagreeable questions. But aloud he answered,
"Nothin', only you seemed scared of it at first. What are you going to do with your share, Matt?"
"Buy a cattle ranch in Arizona and settle down and pay other men to ride range for me. There's several I'd like to see asking a job from me. Damn them! And now you shut your face, Jim. It'll be some time before I buy that ranch. Just now I'm going to sleep."
But Jim lay long awake, nervous and twitching, rolling about restlessly and rolling himself wide awake every time he dozed. The diamonds still blazed under his eyelids, and the fire of them hurt. Matt, in spite of his heavy nature, slept lightly, like a wild animal, alert in his sleep, and Jim noticed every time he moved that his partner's body moved sufficiently to show that it had received the impression and that it was trembling on the verge of awakening. For that matter, Jim did not know whether or not frequently the other was awake. Once, quietly betokening complete consciousness, Matt said to him,
"Ah, go to sleep, Jim. Don't worry about them jewels. They'll keep."
And Jim had thought that at that particular moment Matt had been surely asleep. In the late morning Matt was awake with Jim's first movement, and thereafter he awoke and dozed with him until midday, when they got up together and began dressing.
"I'm going out to get a paper and some bread," Matt said. "You boil the coffee."
As Jim listened unconsciously, his gaze left Matt's face and roved to the pillow, beneath which was the bundle wrapped in the bandana handkerchief. On the instant Matt's face became like a wild beast's.
"Look here, Jim," he snarled. "You've got to play square. If you do me dirt, I'll fix you. Understand? I'd eat you, Jim. You know that. I'd bite right into your throat and eat you like that much beefsteak."
His sunburned skin was black with the surge of blood in it, and his tobacco-stained teeth were exposed by the snarling lips. Jim shivered and involuntarily cowered. There was death in the man he looked at, Only the night before, that black-faced man had killed another with his hands, and it had not hurt his sleep. And in his own heart, Jim was aware of a sneaking guilt, of a train of thought that merited all that was threatened. Matt passed out, leaving him still shivering. Then a hatred twisted his own face, and he softly hurled savage curses at the door. He remembered the jewels and hastened to the bed, feeling under the pillow for the bandana bundle. He crushed it with his fingers to make certain that it still contained the diamonds. Assured that Matt had not carried them away, he looked toward the kerosene stove with a guilty start. Then he hurriedly lighted it, filled the coffee pot at the sink, and put it over the flame. The coffee was boiling when Matt returned, and while the latter cut the bread and put a slice of butter on the table, Jim poured out the coffee. It was not until he sat down and had taken a few sips of the coffee that Matt pulled out the morning paper from his pocket.
"We was way off," he said. "I told you I didn't dast figure out how fat it was. Look at that."
He pointed to the headlines on the first page. "Swift nemesis on Bujanov's track," they read. "Murdered in his sleep after robbing his partner."
"There you have it," Matt cried. "He robbed his partner. Robbed him like a dirty thief."
$500,000 of jewels missin',"
Jim read aloud. He put the paper down and stared at Matt.
"That's what I told you," the latter said. "What in hell do we know about jewels? $500,000, and the best I could figure it was 100,000. Go on and read the rest of it."
They read on silently, their heads side by side, the untouched coffee growing cold. And ever and anon, one or the other burst forth with some salient printed fact.
"I'd like to seen Metzner's face when he opened the safe at the store this morning," Jim gloated.
"He hit the high places right away for Bujanov's house," Matt explained. "Go on and read."
"Was to have sailed last night at 10 on the Sajota for the South Seas. Steamship delayed by extra freight."
"That's why we caught him in bed," Matt interrupted. "It was just luck, like picking a 50-to-1 winner."
"Sajota sailed at 6 this morning."
"He didn't catch her," Matt said. "I saw his alarm clock was set at 5. That'd given him plenty of time. Only I came along and put the kibosh on his time. Go on."
"Adolf Metzner in despair. The famous Haythorn pearl necklace, magnificently assorted pearls valued by experts at from $50,000 to $70,000.
Jim broke off to swear vilely and solemnly, concluding with,
"Those damn oyster eggs worth all that money."
He licked his lips and added,
"They was beauties, and no mistake. Big Brazilian gem," he read on, $80,000. Many valuable gems of the first water. Several thousand small diamonds well worth $40,000.
"What you don't know about jewels is worth knowing," Matt smiled good humoredly.
"Theory of the sleuths," Jim read. "Thieves must have known. Cleverly kept watch on Bujanov's actions. Must have learned his plan and trailed into his house with the fruits of his robbery."
"Clever hell!" Matt broke out. "That's the way reputations is made in the newspapers. How'd we know he was robbing his pardner?"
"Anyway, we've got the goods," Jim grinned. "Let's look at 'em again."
He assured himself that the door was locked and bolted, while Matt brought out the bundle in the bandana and opened it on the table.
"Ain't they beauties, though!"
Jim exclaimed at sight of the pearls, and for a time he had eyes only for them.
"According to the experts, worth from $50,000 to $70,000.
"And women like them things," Matt commented. "And they'll do everything to get 'em, sell themselves, commit murder, anything."
"Just like you and me."
"Not on your life," Matt retorted. "I'll commit murder for them, but not for their own sakes, but for the sake of what they'll get me. That's the difference. Women want the jewels for themselves, and I want the jewels for the women and such things they'll get me."
"Lucky that men and women don't want the same things," Jim remarked.
"That's what makes commerce," Matt agreed. "People wanting different things."
In the middle of the afternoon, Jim went out to buy food. While he was gone, Matt cleared the table of the jewels, wrapping them up as before and putting them under the pillow. Then he lighted the kerosene stove and started to boil water for coffee. A few minutes later, Jim returned.
"Most surprising," he remarked. "Streets and stores and people just like they always was. Nothing changed. And me walking along through it all a millionaire. Nobody looked at me and guessed it."
Matt grunted unsympathetically. He had little comprehension of the lighter whims and fancies of his partner's imagination.
"Did you get a porterhouse?" he demanded.
"Sure, and an inch thick. It's a peach. Look at it."
He unwrapped the steak and held it up for the other's inspection. Then he made the coffee and set the table while Matt fried the steak.
"Don't put on too much of them red peppers," Jim warned. "I ain't used to your Mexican cookin'. You always season too hot."
Matt grunted a laugh and went on with his cooking. Jim poured out the coffee, but first, into the nicked china cup, he emptied a powder he had carried in his vest pocket wrapped in a rice paper. He had turned his back for the moment on his partner, but he did not dare to glance around at him. Matt placed a newspaper on the table, and on the newspaper set the hot frying pan. He cut the steak in half and served Jim and himself.
"Eat her while she's hot,"
he counseled, and with knife and fork set the example.
"She's a dandy," was Jim's judgment after his first mouthful. "But I tell you one thing straight. I'm never going to visit you on that Arizona ranch, so you needn't ask me."
"What's the matter now?" Matt asked.
"Hell's the matter," was the answer. "The Mexican cookin' on your ranch'd be too much for me. If I've got hell a-comin' in the next life, I'm not goin' to torment my insides in this one. Damned peppers!"
He smiled, expelled his breath forcibly to cool his burning mouth, drank some coffee, and went on eating the steak.
"What do you think about the next life, anyway, Matt?"
he asked a little later, while secretly he wondered why the other had not yet touched his coffee.
"Ain't no next life,"
Matt answered, pausing from the steak to take his first sip of coffee.
"Nor heaven, nor hell, nor nothin'. You get all that's comin' right here in this life."
"And afterward?"
Jim queried, out of his morbid curiosity, for he knew that he looked upon a man who was soon to die.
"And afterward?" he repeated.
"Did you ever see a man 2 weeks dead?" the other asked.
Jim shook his head.
"Well, I have. It was like this beefsteak you and me is eatin'. It was once a steer cavortin' over the landscape, but now it's just meat. That's all, just meat. And that's what you and me and all people come to, meat."
Matt gulped down the whole cup of coffee and refilled the cup.
"Are you scared to die?" he asked.
Jim shook his head.
"What's the use? I don't die anyway. I pass on and live again."
"To go stealin' and lyin' and snivellin' through another life and go on that way forever and ever?" Matt sneered.
"Maybe I'll improve," Jim suggested hopefully. "Maybe stealin' won't be necessary in the life to come."
He ceased abruptly and stared straight before him, a frightened expression on his face.
"What's the matter?" Jim demanded.
"Nothin'. I was just wonderin'."
Jim returned to himself with an effort.
"About this dyin' was all."
But he could not shake off the fright that had startled him. It was as if an unseen thing of gloom had passed him by, casting upon him the intangible shadow of its presence. He was aware of a feeling of foreboding. Something ominous was about to happen. Calamity hovered in the air. He gazed fixedly across the table at the other man. He could not understand. Was it that he had blundered and poisoned himself? No. Matt had the nicked cup, and he had certainly put the poison in the nicked cup. It was all his own imagination, was his next thought. It had played him tricks before. Fool. Of course it was. Of course something was about to happen, but it was about to happen to Matt. Had not Matt drunk the whole cup of coffee? Jim brightened up and finished his steak, sopping bread in the gravy when the meat was gone.
"When I was a kid," he began, but broke off abruptly.
Again the unseen thing of gloom had fluttered, and his being was vibrant with premonition of impending misfortune. He felt a disruptive influence at work in the flesh of him, and in all his muscles there was a seeming that they were about to begin to twitch. He sat back suddenly, and as suddenly leaned forward with his elbows on the table. A tremor ran dimly through the muscles of his body. It was like the first rustling of leaves before the oncoming of wind. He clenched his teeth. It came again, a spasmodic tensing of his muscles. He knew panic at the revolt within his being. His muscles no longer recognized his mastery over them. Again they spasmodically tensed, despite the will of him, for he had willed that they should not tense. This was revolution within himself. This was anarchy. and the terror of impotence rushed up in him as his flesh gripped and seemed to seize him in a clutch, chills running up and down his back and sweat starting on his brow. He glanced about the room, and all the details of it smote him with a strange sense of familiarity. It was as though he had just returned from a long journey. He looked across the table at his partner. Matt was watching him and smiling. An expression of horror spread over Jim's face.
"My God, Matt!" he screamed. "You ain't doped me!"
Matt smiled and continued to watch him. In the paroxysm that followed, Jim did not become unconscious. His muscles tensed and twitched and knotted, hurting him and crushing him in their savage grip. And in the midst of it all, it came to him that Matt was acting queerly. He was traveling the same road. The smile had gone from his face, and there was on it an intent expression, as if he were listening to some inner tale of himself and trying to divine the message. Matt got up and walked across the room and back again, then sat down.
"You did this, Jim," he said quietly.
"But I didn't think you'd try to fix me,"
Jim answered reproachfully.
"Oh, I fixed you all right,"
Matt said, with teeth close together and shivering body.
"What did you give me?"
"Strychnine."
"Same as I gave you," Matt volunteered. "It's a hell of a mess, ain't it?"
"You're lying, Matt," Jim pleaded. "You ain't doped me, have you?"
"I sure did, Jim, and I didn't overdose you neither. I cooked it in as neat as you please on your half of the porterhouse. Hold on. Where are you going?"
Jim had made a dash for the door and was throwing back the bolts. Matt sprang in between and shoved him away.
"Drugstore," Jim panted. "Drugstore."
"No, you don't. You'll stay right here. There ain't going to be any running out and making a poison play on the street. Not with all them jewels reposin' under the pillow, savvy? Even if you didn't die, you'd be in the hands of the police with a whole lot of explanations comin'. Emetics is the stuff for poison. I'm just as bad bit as you, and I'm going to take a emetic. That's all they'd give you at the drugstore anyway."
He thrust Jim back into the middle of the room and shot the bolts into place. As he went across the floor to the food shelf, he passed one hand over his brow and flung off the beaded sweat. It spattered audibly on the floor. Jim watched agonizedly as Matt got the mustard can and a cup and ran for the sink. He stirred a cupful of mustard and water and drank it down. Jim had followed him and was reaching with trembling hands for the empty cup. Again Matt shoved him away. As he mixed a second cupful, he demanded,
"Do you think one cup'll do for me? You can wait till I'm done."
Jim started to totter toward the door, but Matt checked him.
"If you monkey with that door, I'll twist your neck, savvy? You can take yours when I'm done, and if it saves you, I'll twist your neck anyway. You ain't got no chance nohow. I told you many times what you'd get if you did me dirt."
"But you did me dirt, too," Jim articulated with an effort.
Matt was drinking the second cupful and did not answer. The sweat had got into Jim's eyes, and he could scarcely see his way to the table, where he got a cup for himself. But Matt was mixing a third cupful, and as before, thrust him away.
"I told you to wait till I was done," Matt growled. "Get out of my way."
And Jim supported his twitching body by holding on to the sink, the while he yearned toward the yellowish concoction that stood for life. It was by sheer will that he stood and clung to the sink. His flesh strove to double him up and bring him to the floor. Matt drank the third cupful, and with difficulty managed to get to a chair and sit down. His first paroxysm was passing. The spasms that afflicted him were dying away. This good effect he ascribed to the mustard and water. He was safe, at any rate. He wiped the sweat from his face, and in the interval of calm found room for curiosity. He looked at his partner. A spasm had shaken the mustard can out of Jim's hands, and the contents were spilled upon the floor. He stooped to scoop some of the mustard into the cup, and the succeeding spasm doubled him upon the floor. Matt smiled.
"Stay with it," he encouraged. "It's the stuff, all right. It's fixed me up."
Jim heard him and turned toward him a stricken face, twisted with suffering and pleading. Spasm now followed spasm till he was in convulsions, rolling on the floor and yellowing his face and hair in the mustard. Matt laughed hoarsely at the sight, but the laugh broke midway. A tremor had run through his body. A new paroxysm was beginning.
He arose and staggered across to the sink, where with probing forefinger he vainly strove to assist the action of the emetic. In the end he clung to the sink as Jim had clung, filled with the horror of going down to the floor. The other's paroxysm had passed, and he sat up, weak and fainting, too weak to rise, his forehead dripping, his lips flecked with a foam made yellow by the mustard in which he had rolled. He rubbed his eyes with his knuckles, and groans that were like whines came from his throat.
"What are you sniffing about?"
Matt demanded out of his agony.
"All you got to do is die, and when you die, you're dead."
"I ain't sniffin'. It's the mustard stingin' my eyes," Jim panted with desperate slowness. It was his last successful attempt at speech. Thereafter he babbled incoherently, pawing the air with shaking arms till a fresh convulsion stretched him on the floor. Matt struggled back to the chair, and, doubled up on it, with his arms clasped about his knees, he fought with his disintegrating flesh. He came out of the convulsion cool and weak. He looked to see how it went with the other, and saw him lying motionless. He tried to soliloquize, to be facetious, to have his last grim laugh at life, but his lips made only incoherent sounds. The thought came to him that the emetic had failed, and that nothing remained but the drug store. He looked toward the door and drew himself to his feet. There he saved himself from falling by clutching the chair. Another paroxysm had begun, and in the midst of the paroxysm, with his body and all the parts of it flying apart and writhing and twisting back again into knots, he clung to the chair and shoved it before him across the floor. The last shreds of his will were leaving him when he gained the door. He turned the key and shot back one bolt. He fumbled for the second bolt, but failed. Then he leaned his weight against the door and slid down gently to the floor. End of Section 4, read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California, shaggybark.blogspot.com. Section 5 of When God Laughs by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Section 5. Created He Them. She met him at the door. "I did not think you would be so early." "It is 8:30. He looked at his watch. "The train leaves at 9:12. He was very businesslike until he saw her lips tremble as she abruptly turned and led the way. "It'll be all right, little woman," he said soothingly. "Dr. Boddenau's the man. He'll pull him through, you'll see." They entered the living room. His glance quested apprehensively about, then turned to her. "Where's Al?" She did not answer, but with a sudden impulse came close to him and stood motionless. She was a slender, dark-eyed woman in whose face was stamped the strain and stress of living. But the fine lines and the haunted look in the eyes were not the handiwork of mere worry. He knew whose handiwork it was as he looked upon it, and she knew when she consulted her mirror. "It's no use, Mary," he said. He put his hand on her shoulder. "We've tried everything. It's a wretched business, I know, but what else can we do? You've failed. Dr. Boddenau's all that's left." "If I had another chance," she began falteringly. "We've threshed that all out," he answered harshly. "You've got to buck up now. You know what conclusion we arrived at. You know you haven't the ghost of a hope in another chance." She shook her head. "I know it, but it is terrible, the thought of his going away to fight it out alone." "He won't be alone. There's Dr. Boddenau. And besides, it's a beautiful place." She remained silent. "It is the only thing," he said. "It is the only thing," she repeated mechanically. He looked at his watch. "Where's Al?" "I'll send him." When the door had closed behind her, he walked over to the window and looked out, drumming absently with his knuckles on the pane. "Hello." He turned and responded to the greeting of the man who had just entered. There was a perceptible drag to the man's feet as he walked across toward the window and paused irresolutely halfway. "I've changed my mind, George," he announced hurriedly and nervously. "I'm not going."
He plucked at his sleeve, shuffled with his feet, dropped his eyes, and with a strong effort raised them again to confront the other. George regarded him silently, his nostrils distending and his lean fingers unconsciously crooking like an eagle's talons about to clutch. In line and feature there was much of resemblance between the two men, and yet, in the strongest resemblances, there was a radical difference. Theirs were the same black eyes, but those of the man at the window were sharp and straight looking, while those of the man in the middle of the room were cloudy and furtive. He could not face the other's gaze, and continually and vainly struggled with himself to do so. The high cheekbones and the hollows beneath were the same, yet the texture of the hollows seemed different. The thin-lipped mouths were from the same mold, but George's lips were firm and muscular, while Al's were soft and loose, the lips of an ascetic turned voluptuary. There was also a sag at the corners. His flesh hinted of grossness, especially so in the eagle-like aquiline nose that must once have been like the others, but that had lost the austerity the others still retained. Al fought for steadiness in the middle of the floor. The silence bothered him. He had a feeling that he was about to begin swaying back and forth. He moistened his lips with his tongue. "I'm going to stay," he said desperately. He dropped his eyes and plucked again at his sleeve. "And you are only 26 years old," George said at last. "You poor, feeble old man." "Don't be so sure of that," Al retorted with a flash of belligerence. "Do you remember when we swam that 1.5 miles across the channel?" "Well, and what of it?" A sullen expression was creeping across Al's face. "And do you remember when we boxed in the barn after school?" "I could take all you gave me." "All I gave you?" George's voice rose momentarily to a higher pitch. "You licked me 4 afternoons out of 5. You were twice as strong as I, 3 times as strong. And now I'd be afraid to land on you with a sofa cushion. You'd crumple up like a last year's leaf. You'd die, you poor, miserable old man." "You needn't abuse me just because I've changed my mind," the other protested, the hint of a whine in his voice. His wife entered, and he looked appealingly to her. But the man at the window strode suddenly up to him and burst out. "You don't know your own mind for 2 successive minutes. You haven't any mind, you spineless, crawling worm." "You can't make me angry." Al smiled with cunning and glanced triumphantly at his wife. "You can't make me angry," he repeated, as though the idea were thoroughly gratifying to him. "I know your game. It's my stomach, I tell you. I can't help it. Before God, I can't. Isn't it my stomach, Mary?" She glanced at George and spoke composedly, though she hid a trembling hand in a fold of her skirt. "Isn't it time?" she asked softly. Her husband turned upon her savagely. "I'm not going to go," he cried. "That's just what I've been telling him. And I tell you again, all of you, I'm not going. You can't bully me." "Why, Al, dear, you said," she began. "Never mind what I said," he broke out. "I've said something else right now, and you've heard it, and that settles it." He walked across the room and threw himself with emphasis into a Morris chair. But the other man was swiftly upon him. The talon-like fingers gripped his shoulders, jerked him to his feet, and held him there. "You've reached the limit, Al, and I want you to understand it. I've tried to treat you like my brother, but hereafter I shall treat you like the thing that you are. Do you understand?" The anger in his voice was cold. The blaze in his eyes was cold. It was vastly more effective than any outburst, and Al cringed under it and under the clutching hand that was bruising his shoulder muscles. "It is only because of me that you have this house, that you have the food you eat. Your position? Any other man would have been shown the door a year ago, 2 years ago. I have held you in it. Your salary has been charity. It has been paid out of my pocket. Mary, her dresses, that gown she has on, is made over. She wears the discarded dresses of her sisters, of my wife. Charity, do you understand? Your children, they are wearing the discarded clothes of my children, of the children of my neighbors who think the clothes went to some orphan asylum. And it is an orphan asylum, or it soon will be." He emphasized each point with an unconscious tightening of his grip on the shoulder. Al was squirming with the pain of it. The sweat was starting out on his forehead. "Now you listen well to me," his brother went on. "In 3 minutes you will tell me that you are going with me. If you don't, Mary and the children will be taken away from you to day. You needn't ever come to the office. This house will be closed to you, and in 6 months I shall have the pleasure of burying you. You have 3 minutes to make up your mind." Al made a strangling movement and reached up with weak fingers to the clutching hand. "My heart, let me go. You'll be the death of me," he gasped. The hand thrust him down forcibly into the Morris chair and released him. The clock on the mantel ticked loudly. George glanced at it, and at Mary. She was leaning against the table, unable to conceal her trembling. He became unpleasantly aware of the feeling of his brother's fingers on his hand. Quite unconsciously, he wiped the back of the hand upon his coat. The clock ticked on in the silence. It seemed to George that the room reverberated with his voice. He could hear himself still speaking. "I'll go," came from the Morris chair. It was a weak and shaken voice, and it was a weak and shaken man that pulled himself out of the Morris chair. He started toward the door. "Where are you going?" George demanded. "Suitcase," came the response. "Mary'll send the trunk later. I'll be back in a minute." The door closed after him. A moment later, struck with sudden suspicion, George was opening the door. He glanced in. His brother stood at a sideboard, in one hand a decanter, in the other hand, bottom up and to his lips, a whiskey glass. Across the glass, Al saw that he was observed. It threw him into a panic. Hastily he tried to refill the glass and get it to his lips, but glass and decanter were sent smashing to the floor. He snarled. It was like the sound of a wild beast, but the grip on his shoulder subdued and frightened him. He was being propelled toward the door. "The suitcase," he gasped. "It's there in that room. Let me get it." "Where's the key?" his brother asked, when he had brought it. "It isn't locked." The next moment the suitcase was spread open, and George's hand was searching the contents. From one side it brought out a bottle of whiskey, from the other side a flask. He snapped the case to. "Come on," he said. "If we miss one car, we miss that train." He went out into the hallway, leaving Al with his wife. It was like a funeral, George thought, as he waited. His brother's overcoat caught on the knob of the front door and delayed its closing long enough for Mary's first sob to come to their ears. George's lips were very thin and compressed as he went down the steps. In one hand he carried the suitcase. With the other hand he held his brother's arm. As they neared the corner, he heard the electric car a block away and urged his brother on. Al was breathing hard. His feet dragged and shuffled, and he held back. "A hell of a brother you are," he panted. For reply, he received a vicious jerk on his arm. It reminded him of his childhood when he was hurried along by some angry grown-up, and like a child he had to be helped up the car step. He sank down on an outside seat, panting, sweating, overcome by the exertion. He followed George's eyes as the latter looked him up and down. "A hell of a brother you are," was George's comment when he had finished the inspection. Moisture welled into Al's eyes. "It's my stomach," he said with self-pity. "I don't wonder," was the retort. "Burned out like the crater of a volcano. Fervent heat isn't a circumstance." Thereafter they did not speak. When they arrived at the transfer point, George came to himself with a start. He smiled. With fixed gaze that did not see the houses that streamed across his field of vision, he had himself been sunk deep in self-pity. He helped his brother from the car and looked up the intersecting street. The car they were to take was not in sight. Al's eyes chanced upon the corner grocery and saloon across the way. At once he became restless. His hands passed beyond his control, and he yearned hungrily across the street to the door that swung open even as he looked and let in a happy pilgrim. And in that instant he saw the white-jacketed bartender against an array of glittering glass. Quite unconsciously he started across the street. "Hold on." George's hand was on his arm. "I want some whiskey," he answered. "You've already had some." "That was hours ago. Go on, George. Let me have some. It's the last day.
Don't shut off on me until we get there. God knows it will be soon enough."
George glanced desperately up the street. The car was in sight.
"There isn't time for a drink," he said.
"I don't want a drink. I want a bottle."
Al's voice became wheedling.
"Go on, George. It's the very last."
"No."
The denial was as final as George's thin lips could make it. Al glanced at the approaching car. He sat down suddenly on the curbstone.
"What's the matter?"
his brother asked with momentary alarm.
"Nothing. I want some whiskey. It's my stomach."
"Come on now. Get up."
George reached for him, but was anticipated, for his brother sprawled flat on the pavement, oblivious to the dirt and to the curious glances of the passers by. The car was clanging its gong at the crossing, a block away.
"You'll miss it."
Al grinned from the pavement.
"And it will be your fault."
George's fists clenched tightly.
"For 2 cents, I'd give you a thrashing."
"And miss the car,"
was the triumphant comment from the pavement. George looked at the car. It was halfway down the block. He looked at his watch. He debated a second longer.
"All right," he said. "I'll get it, but you get on that car. If you miss it, I'll break the bottle over your head."
He dashed across the street and into the saloon. The car came in and stopped. There were no passengers to get off. Al dragged himself up the steps and sat down. He smiled as the conductor rang the bell and the car started. The swinging door of the saloon burst open. Clutching in his hand the suitcase and the pint bottle of whiskey, George started in pursuit. The conductor, his hand on the bell cord, waited to see if it would be necessary to stop. It was not. George swung lightly aboard, sat down beside his brother, and passed him the bottle.
"You might have got a quart," Al said reproachfully.
He extracted the cork with a pocket corkscrew and elevated the bottle.
"I'm sick. My stomach,"
he explained in apologetic tones to the passenger who sat next to him. In the train they sat in the smoking car. George felt that it was imperative. Also, having successfully caught the train, his heart softened. He felt more kindly toward his brother, and accused himself of unnecessary harshness. He strove to atone by talking about their mother and sisters and the little affairs and interests of the family. But Al was morose and devoted himself to the bottle. As the time passed, his mouth hung looser and looser, while the rings under his eyes seemed to puff out and all his facial muscles to relax.
"It's my stomach,"
he said once when he finished the bottle and dropped it under the seat. But the swift hardening of his brother's face did not encourage further explanations. The conveyance that met them at the station had all the dignity and luxuriousness of a private carriage. George's eyes were keen for the earmarks of the institution to which they were going, but his apprehensions were allayed from moment to moment. As they entered the wide gateway and rolled on through the spacious grounds, he felt sure that the institutional side of the place would not jar upon his brother. It was more like a summer hotel, or better yet, a country club. And as they swept on through the spring sunshine, the songs of birds in his ears and in his nostrils the breath of flowers, George sighed for a week of rest in such a place, and before his eyes loomed the arid vista of summer in town and at the office. There was not room in his income for his brother and himself. "Let's take a walk in the grounds," he suggested after they had met Dr. Bodineau and inspected the quarters assigned to Al. "The carriage leaves for the station in half an hour, and we'll just have time." "It's beautiful," he remarked a moment later. Under his feet was the velvet grass, the trees arched overhead, and he stood in mottled sunshine. "I wish I could stay for a month."
"I'll trade places with you," Al said quickly.
George laughed it off, but he felt a sinking of the heart. "Look at that oak!" he cried. "And that woodpecker! Isn't he a beauty?"
"I don't like it here," he heard his brother mutter.
George's lips tightened in preparation for the struggle, but he said, "I'm going to send Mary and the children off to the mountains. She needs it, and so do they. And when you're in shape, I'll send you right on to join them. Then you can take your summer vacation before you come back to the office."
"I'm not going to stay in this damned hole for all you talk about it," Al announced abruptly.
"Yes, you are, and you're going to get your health and strength back again so that the look of you will put the color in Mary's cheeks where it used to be."
"I'm going back with you." Al's voice was firm. "I'm going to take the same train back. It's about time for that carriage, I guess."
"I haven't told you all my plans," George tried to go on, but Al cut him off.
"You might as well quit that. I don't want any of your soapy talking. You treat me like a child. I'm not a child. My mind's made up, and I'll show you how long it can stay made up. You needn't talk to me. I don't care a rap for what you're going to say."
A baleful light was in his eyes, and to his brother he seemed for all the world like a cornered rat, desperate and ready to fight. As George looked at him, he remembered back to their childhood, and it came to him that at last was aroused in Al the same old stubborn strain that had enabled him as a child to stand against all force and persuasion. George abandoned hope. He had lost. This creature was not human. The last fine instinct of the human had fled. It was a brute, sluggish and stolid, impossible to move, just the raw stuff of life, combative, rebellious, and indomitable. And as he contemplated his brother, he felt in himself the rising up of a similar brute. He became suddenly aware that his fingers were tensing and crooking like a thug's, and he knew the desire to kill. And his reason, turned traitor at last, counseled that he should kill, that it was the only thing left for him to do. He was aroused by a servant calling to him through the trees that the carriage was waiting. He answered. Then, looking straight before him, he discovered his brother. He had forgotten it was his brother. It had been only a thing the moment before. He began to talk, and as he talked, the way became clear to him. His reason had not turned traitor. The brute in him had merely orientated his reason. "You are no earthly good, Al," he said. "You know that. You've made Mary's life a hell. You are a curse to your children. And you have not made life exactly a paradise for the rest of us."
"There's no use your talking," Al interjected. "I'm not going to stay here."
"That's what I'm coming to," George continued. "You don't have to stay here." Al's face brightened, and he involuntarily made a movement as though about to start toward the carriage. "On the other hand, it is not necessary that you should return with me. There is another way." George's hand went to his hip pocket and appeared with a revolver. It lay along his palm, the butt toward Al, and toward Al he extended it. At the same time, with his head, he indicated the nearby thicket.
"You can't bluff me," Al snarled.
"It is not a bluff, Al. Look at me. I mean it. And if you don't do it for yourself, I shall have to do it for you." They faced each other, the proffered revolver still extended. Al debated for a moment. Then his eyes blazed. With a quick movement, he seized the revolver.
"My God, I'll do it," he said. "I'll show you what I've got in me."
George felt suddenly sick. He turned away. He did not see his brother enter the thicket, but he heard the passage of his body through the leaves and branches. "Good bye, Al," he called.
"Good bye," came from the thicket.
George felt the sweat upon his forehead. He began mopping his face with his handkerchief. He heard, as from a remote distance, the voice of the servant again calling to him that the carriage was waiting. The woodpecker dropped down through the mottled sunshine and lighted on the trunk of a tree a dozen feet away. George felt that it was all a dream, and yet through it all he felt supreme justification. It was the right thing to do. It was the only thing. His whole body gave a spasmodic start, as though the revolver had been fired. It was the voice of Al close at his back.
"Here's your gun," Al said. "I'll stay."
The servant appeared among the trees, approaching rapidly and calling anxiously. George put the weapon in his pocket and caught both his brother's hands in his own. "God bless you, old man," he murmured, and, with a final squeeze of the hands, "good luck." "I'm coming," he called to the servant, and turned and ran through the trees toward the carriage. End of Section 5, read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California, shaggybark.blogspot.com. Section 6 of When God Laughs by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Section 6. The Chinago. The coral waxes, the palm grows, but man departs. Tahitian proverb. Ah Cho did not understand French. He sat in the crowded courtroom, very weary and bored, listening to the unceasing, explosive French that now one official and now another uttered. It was just so much gabble to Ah Cho, and he marveled at the stupidity of the Frenchman who took so long to find out the murderer of Chung Ga, and who did not find him at all. The 500 coolies on the plantation knew that Ah San had done the killing, and here was Ah San not even arrested. It was true that all the coolies had agreed secretly not to testify against one another, but then it was so simple. The Frenchman should have been able to discover that Ah San was the man. They were very stupid, these Frenchmen. Ah Cho had done nothing of which to be afraid. He had had no hand in the killing. It was true he had been present at it, and Schemmer, the overseer on the plantation, had rushed into the barracks immediately afterward and caught him there, along with 4 or 5 others. But what of that? Chung Ga had been stabbed only twice. It stood to reason that 5 or 6 men could not inflict 2 stab wounds. At the most, if a man had struck but once, only 2 men could have done it. So it was that Ah Cho reasoned, when he, along with his 4 companions, had lied and blocked and obfuscated in their statements to the court concerning what had taken place. They had heard the sounds of the killing, and, like Schemmer, they had run to the spot. They had got there before Schemmer. That was all. True, Schemmer had testified that, attracted by the sound of quarreling as he chanced to pass by, he had stood for at least 5 minutes outside. That then, when he entered, he found the prisoners already inside, and that they had not entered just before because he had been standing by the one door to the barracks. But what of that? Ah Cho and his 4 fellow prisoners had testified that Schemmer was mistaken. In the end, they would be let go. They were all confident of that. 5 men could not have their heads cut off for 2 stab wounds. Besides, no foreign devil had seen the killing. But these Frenchmen were so stupid. In China, as Ah Cho well knew, the magistrate would order all of them to the torture and learn the truth. The truth was very easy to learn under torture, but these Frenchmen did not torture. Bigger fools they. Therefore, they would never find out who killed Chung Ga. But Ah Cho did not understand everything. The English company that owned the plantation had imported into Tahiti, at great expense, the 500 coolies. The stockholders were clamoring for dividends, and the company had not yet paid any. Wherefore, the company did not want its costly contract laborers to start the practice of killing one another. Also, there were the French, eager and willing to impose upon the Chinagos the virtues and excellences of French law. There was nothing like setting an example once in a while, and, besides, of what use was New Caledonia except to send men to live out their days in misery and pain in payment of the penalty for being frail and human? Ah Cho did not understand all this. He sat in the courtroom and waited for the baffled judgment that would set him and his comrades free to go back to the plantation and work out the terms of their contracts. This judgment would soon be rendered. Proceedings were drawing to a close. He could see that. There was no more testifying, no more gabble of tongues. The French devils were tired, too, and evidently waiting for the judgment. And as he waited, he remembered back in his life to the time when he had signed the contract and set sail in the ship for Tahiti. Times had been hard in his seacoast village, and when he indentured himself to labor for 5 years in the South Seas at 50 cents Mexican a day, he had thought himself fortunate. There were men in his village who toiled a whole year for $10 Mexican, and there were women who made nets all the year round for $5, while in the houses of shopkeepers there were maidservants who received $4 for a year of service. And here he was to receive 50 cents a day, for 1 day, only 1 day. He was to receive that princely sum. What if the work were hard? At the end of the 5 years he would return home. That was in the contract, and he would never have to work again. He would be a rich man for life, with a house of his own, a wife and children growing up to venerate him. Yes, and back of the house he would have a small garden, a place of meditation and repose, with goldfish in a tiny lakelet, and wind bells tinkling in the several trees. And there would be a high wall all around so that his meditation and repose should be undisturbed. Well, he had worked out 3 of those 5 years. He was already a wealthy man, in his own country, through his earnings, and only 2 years more intervened between the cotton plantation on Tahiti and the meditation and repose that awaited him. But just now he was losing money because of the unfortunate accident of being present at the killing of Chung Ga. He had lain 3 weeks in prison, and for each day of those 3 weeks he had lost 50 cents. But now judgment would soon be given, and he would go back to work. Ah Cho was 22 years old. He was happy and good natured, and it was easy for him to smile. While his body was slim in the Asiatic way, his face was rotund. It was round, like the moon, and it irradiated a gentle complacence and a sweet kindliness of spirit that was unusual among his countrymen. Nor did his looks belie him. He never caused trouble, never took part in wrangling. He did not gamble. His soul was not harsh enough for the soul that must belong to a gambler. He was content with little things and simple pleasures. The hush and quiet in the cool of the day, after the blazing toil in the cotton field, was to him an infinite satisfaction. He could sit for hours gazing at a solitary flower and philosophizing about the mysteries and riddles of being. A blue heron on a tiny crescent of sandy beach, a silvery splatter of flying fish, or a sunset of pearl and rose across the lagoon, could entrance him to all forgetfulness of the procession of wearisome days and of the heavy lash of Schemmer. Schemmer, Karl Schemmer, was a brutish brute, but he earned his salary. He got the last particle of strength out of the 500 slaves, for slaves they were until their term of years was up. Schemmer worked hard to extract the strength from those 500 sweating bodies and to transmute it into bales of fluffy cotton ready for export. His dominant, iron-clad, primeval brutishness was what enabled him to effect the transmutation. Also, he was assisted by a thick leather belt 3 inches wide and a yard in length, with which he always rode, and which on occasion could come down on the naked back of a stooping coolie with a report like a pistol shot. These reports were frequent when Schemmer rode down the furrowed field. Once, at the beginning of the first year of contract labor, he had killed a coolie with a single blow of his fist. He had not exactly crushed the man's head like an eggshell, but the blow had been sufficient to addle what was inside, and after being sick for a week, the man had died. But the Chinese had not complained to the French devils that ruled over Tahiti. It was their own lookout. Schemmer was their problem. They must avoid his wrath as they avoided the venom of the centipedes that lurked in the grass or crept into the sleeping quarters on rainy nights. The Chinagos, such they were called by the indolent, brown-skinned island folk, saw to it that they did not displease Schemmer too greatly. This was equivalent to rendering up to him a full measure of efficient toil. That blow of Schemmer's fist had been worth thousands of dollars to the company, and no trouble ever came of it to Schemmer. The French, with no instinct for colonization, futile in their childish play game of developing the resources of the island, were only too glad to see the English company succeed. What matter of Schemmer and his redoubtable fist? The Chinago that died? Well, he was only a Chinago. Besides, he died of sunstroke, as the doctor's certificate attested. True, in all the history of Tahiti, no one had ever died of sunstroke. But it was precisely that, which made the death of this Chinago unique. The doctor said as much in his report. He was very candid. Dividends must be paid, or else one more failure would be added to the long history of failure in Tahiti. There was no understanding these white devils. Ah Cho pondered their inscrutableness as he sat in the courtroom waiting the judgment. There was no telling what went on at the back of their minds. He had seen a few of the white devils. They were all alike. The officers and sailors on the ship, the French officials, the several white men on the plantation, including Schemmer. Their minds all moved in mysterious ways there was no getting at. They grew angry without apparent cause, and their anger was always dangerous. They were like wild beasts at such times. They worried about little things, and on occasion could out-toil even a Chinago. They were not temperate as Chinagos were temperate. They were gluttons, eating prodigiously and drinking more prodigiously. A Chinago never knew when an act would please them or arouse a storm of wrath. A Chinago could never tell. What pleased one time, the very next time might provoke an outburst of anger. There was a curtain behind the eyes of the white devils that screened the backs of their minds from the Chinago's gaze. And then, on top of it all, was that terrible efficiency of the white devils, that ability to do things, to make things go, to work results, to bend to their wills all creeping, crawling things, and the powers of the very elements themselves. Yes, the white men were strange and wonderful, and they were devils. Look at Schemmer. Ah Cho wondered why the judgment was so long in forming. Not a man on trial had laid hand on Chung Ga. Ah San alone had killed him. Ah San had done it, bending Chung Ga's head back with one hand by a grip of his queue, and with the other hand from behind reaching over and driving the knife into his body. Twice had he driven it in. There in the court room, with closed eyes, Ah Cho saw the killing acted over again. The squabble, the vile words bandied back and forth, the filth and insult flung upon venerable ancestors, the curses laid upon unbegotten generations, the leap of Ah San, the grip on the queue of Chung Ga, the knife that sank twice into his flesh, the bursting open of the door, the eruption of Schemmer, the dash for the door, the escape of Ah San, the flying belt of Schemmer that drove the rest into the corner, and the firing of the revolver as a signal that brought help to Schemmer. Ah Cho shivered as he lived it over. One blow of the belt had bruised his cheek, taking off some of the skin. Schemmer had pointed to the bruises when, on the witness stand, he had identified Ah Cho. It was only just now that the marks had become no longer visible. That had been a blow. Half an inch nearer the center, and it would have taken out his eye. Then Ah Cho forgot the whole happening in a vision he caught of the garden of meditation and repose that would be his when he returned to his own land. He sat with impassive face while the magistrate rendered the judgment. Likewise were the faces of his four companions impassive, and they remained impassive when the interpreter explained that the five of them had been found guilty of the murder of Chung Ga, and that Ah Chow should have his head cut off. Ah Cho served 20 years in prison in New Caledonia, Wong Lee 12 years, and Ah Tong 10 years. There was no use in getting excited about it. Even Ah Chow remained expressionless as a mummy, though it was his head that was to be cut off. The magistrate added a few words, and the interpreter explained that Ah Chow's face, having been most severely bruised by Schemmer's strap, had made his identification so positive that since one man must die, he might as well be that man. Also, the fact that Ah Cho's face likewise had been severely bruised, conclusively proving his presence at the murder and his undoubted participation, had merited him the 20 years of penal servitude. And down to the 10 years of Ah Tong, the proportioned reason for each sentence was explained. Let the Chinagos take the lesson to heart, the court said finally, for they must learn that the law would be fulfilled in Tahiti, though the heavens fell. The 5 Chinagos were taken back to jail. They were not shocked nor grieved. The sentences, being unexpected, was quite what they were accustomed to in their dealings with the white devils. From them a Chinago rarely expected more than the unexpected. The heavy punishment for a crime they had not committed was no stranger than the countless strange things that white devils did. In the weeks that followed, Ah Cho often contemplated Ah Chow with mild curiosity. His head was to be cut off by the guillotine that was being erected on the plantation. For him there would be no declining years, no gardens of tranquility. Ah Cho philosophized and speculated about life and death. As for himself, he was not perturbed. 20 years were merely 20 years. By that much was his garden removed from him. That was all. He was young, and the patience of Asia was in his bones. He could wait those 20 years, and by that time the heats of his blood would be assuaged, and he would be better fitted for that garden of calm delight. He thought of a name for it. He would call it the Garden of the Morning Calm. He was made happy all day by the thought, and he was inspired to devise a moral maxim on the virtue of patience, which maxim proved a great comfort, especially to Wong Lee and Ah Tong. Ah Chow, however, did not care for the maxim. His head was to be separated from his body in so short a time that he had no need for patience to wait for that event. He smoked well, ate well, slept well, and did not worry about the slow passage of time. Cruchot was a gendarme. He had seen 20 years of service in the colonies, from Nigeria and Senegal to the South Seas, and those 20 years had not perceptibly brightened his dull mind. He was as slow-witted and stupid as his peasant days in the south of France. He knew discipline and fear of authority, and from God down to the sergeant of gendarmes the only difference to him was the measure of slavish obedience which he rendered. In point of fact, the sergeant bulked bigger in his mind than God, except on Sundays when God's mouthpieces had their say. God was usually very remote, while the sergeant was ordinarily very close at hand. Cruchot it was who received the order from the Chief Justice to the jailer commanding that functionary to deliver over to Cruchot the person of Ah Chow. Now it happened that the Chief Justice had given a dinner the night before to the captain and officers of the French man of war. His hand was shaking when he wrote out the order, and his eyes were aching so dreadfully that he did not read over the order. It was only a Chinago's life he was signing away anyway. So he did not notice that he had omitted the final letter in Ah Chow's name. The order read Ah Cho, and when Cruchot presented the order, the jailer turned over to him the person of Ah Cho. Cruchot took that person beside him on the seat of a wagon behind 2 mules and drove away. Ah Cho was glad to be out in the sunshine. He sat beside the gendarme and beamed. He beamed more ardently than ever when he noted the mules headed south towards Atimaono. Undoubtedly, Schemmer had sent for him to be brought back. Schemmer wanted him to work. Very well, he would work well. Schemmer would never have cause to complain. It was a hot day. There had been a stoppage of the trades. The mules sweated, Cruchot sweated, and Ah Cho sweated. But it was Ah Cho that bore the heat with the least concern. He had toiled 3 years under that sun on the plantation. He beamed and beamed with such genial good nature that even Cruchot's heavy mind was stirred to wonderment. "You are very funny," he said at last. Ah Cho nodded and beamed more ardently. Unlike the magistrate, Cruchot spoke to him in the Kanaka tongue, and this, like all Chinagos and all foreign devils, Ah Cho understood. "You laugh too much," Cruchot chided. "One's heart should be full of tears on a day like this." "I am glad to get out of the jail." "Is that all?" The gendarme shrugged his shoulders. "Is it not enough?" was the retort. "Then you are not glad to have your head cut off?" Ah Cho looked at him in abrupt perplexity and said, "Why, I am going back to Atimaono to work on the plantation for Schemmer. Are you not taking me to Atimaono?" Cruchot stroked his long mustaches reflectively. "Well, well," he said, finally, with a flick of the whip at the off mule. "So you don't know?" "Know what?" Ah Cho was beginning to feel a vague alarm. "Won't Schemmer let me work for him any more?" "Not after to day." Cruchot laughed heartily. It was a good joke. "You see, you won't be able to work after to day. A man with his head off can't work, eh?" He poked the Chinago in the ribs and chuckled. Ah Cho maintained silence while the mules trotted a hot mile. Then he spoke. "Is Schemmer going to cut off my head?" Cruchot grinned as he nodded. "It is a mistake," said Ah Cho gravely. "I am not the Chinago that is to have his head cut off. I am Ah Cho. The honorable judge has determined that I am to stop 20 years in New Caledonia." The gendarme laughed. It was a good joke, this funny Chinago trying to cheat the guillotine. The mules trotted through a cocoanut grove and for half a mile beside the sparkling sea before Ah Cho spoke again. "I tell you I am not Ah Chow. The honorable judge did not say that my head was to go off." "Don't be afraid," said Cruchot, with the philanthropic intention of making it easier for his prisoner. "It is not difficult to die that way." He snapped his fingers. "It is quick, like that. It is not like hanging on the end of a rope and kicking and making faces for 5 minutes. It is like killing a chicken with a hatchet. You cut its head off, that is all. And it is the same with a man. Poof! It is over. It doesn't hurt.
You don't even think it hurts. You don't think. Your head is gone, so you cannot think. It is very good. That is the way I want to die. Quick, quick. You are lucky to die that way. You might get the leprosy and fall to pieces slowly, a finger at a time, and now and again a thumb, also the toes. I knew a man who was burned by hot water. It took him 2 days to die. You could hear him yelling a kilometer away. But you? So easy. The knife cuts your neck like that. It is finished. The knife may even tickle. Who can say? Nobody who died that way ever came back to say.
He considered his last excruciating joke, and permitted himself to be convulsed with laughter for half a minute. Part of his mirth was assumed, but he considered it his humane duty to cheer up the Chinago.
But I tell you I am Ah Cho, the other persisted. I don't want my head cut off.
Cruchot scowled. The Chinago was carrying the foolishness too far.
I am not Ah Chow,
Ah Cho began.
That will do,
the gendarme interrupted. He puffed up his cheeks and strove to appear fierce.
I tell you I am not,
Ah Cho began again.
Shut up,
bawled Cruchot. After that they rode along in silence. It was 20 miles from Papeete to Atimaono, and over half the distance was covered by the time the Chinago again ventured into speech.
I saw you in the courtroom when the honorable judge sought after our guilt, he began. Very good. And do you remember that Ah Chow, whose head is to be cut off, do you remember that he, Ah Chow, was a tall man? Look at me.
He stood up suddenly, and Cruchot saw that he was a short man. And just as suddenly Cruchot caught a glimpse of a memory picture of Ah Chow, and in that picture Ah Chow was tall. To the gendarme, all Chinagos looked alike. One face was like another. But between tallness and shortness he could differentiate, and he knew that he had the wrong man beside him on the seat. He pulled up the mules abruptly so that the pole shot ahead of them, elevating their collars.
You see, it was a mistake,
said Ah Cho, smiling pleasantly. But Cruchot was thinking. Already he regretted that he had stopped the wagon. He was unaware of the error of the Chief Justice, and he had no way of working it out. But he did know that he had been given this Chinago to take to Atimaono, and that it was his duty to take him to Atimaono. What if he was the wrong man, and they cut his head off? It was only a Chinago when all was said. And what was a Chinago, anyway? Besides, it might not be a mistake. He did not know what went on in the minds of his superiors. They knew their business best. Who was he to do their thinking for them? Once, in the long ago, he had attempted to think for them, and the sergeant had said,
Cruchot, you are a fool. The quicker you know that, the better you will get on. You are not to think. You are to obey and leave the thinking to your betters.
He smarted under the recollection. Also, if he turned back to Papeete, he would delay the execution at Atimaono, and if he were wrong in turning back, he would get a reprimand from the sergeant, who was waiting for the prisoner. And, furthermore, he would get a reprimand at Papeete as well. He touched the mules with the whip and drove on. He looked at his watch. He would be half an hour late as it was, and the sergeant was bound to be angry. He put the mules into a faster trot. The more Ah Cho persisted in explaining the mistake, the more stubborn Cruchot became. The knowledge that he had the wrong man did not make his temper better. The knowledge that it was through no mistake of his confirmed him in the belief that the wrong he was doing was the right. And rather than incur the displeasure of the sergeant, he would willingly have assisted a dozen wrong Chinagos to their doom. As for Ah Cho, after the gendarme had struck him over the head with the butt of the whip and commanded him in a loud voice to shut up, there remained nothing for him to do but shut up. The long ride continued in silence. Ah Cho pondered the strange ways of the foreign devils. There was no explaining them. What they were doing with him was of a piece with everything they did. First they found guilty 5 innocent men, and next they cut off the head of the man that even they, in their benighted ignorance, had deemed meritorious of no more than 20 years' imprisonment. And there was nothing he could do. He could only sit idly and take what these lords of life measured out to him. Once he got in a panic, and the sweat upon his body turned cold, but he fought his way out of it. He endeavored to resign himself to his fate by remembering and repeating certain passages from the Yin Chi Wen, the Tract of the Quiet Way. But, instead, he kept seeing his dream garden of meditation and repose. This bothered him until he abandoned himself to the dream and sat in his garden listening to the tinkling of the wind bells in the several trees. And lo! sitting thus in the dream, he was able to remember and repeat the passages from the Tract of the Quiet Way. So the time passed nicely until Atimanoo was reached and the mules trotted up to the foot of the scaffold, in the shade of which stood the impatient sergeant. Ah Cho was hurried up the ladder of the scaffold. Beneath him on one side he saw assembled all the coolies of the plantation. Schemmer had decided that the event would be a good object lesson, so he called in the coolies from the fields and compelled them to be present. As they caught sight of Ah Cho, they gabbled among themselves in low voices. They saw the mistake, but they kept it to themselves. The inexplicable white devils had doubtlessly changed their minds. Instead of taking the life of one innocent man, they were taking the life of another innocent man. Ah Chow or Ah Cho, what did it matter which? They could never understand the white dogs any more than could the white dogs understand them. Ah Cho was going to have his head cut off, but they, when their 2 remaining years of servitude were up, were going back to China. Schemmer had made the guillotine himself. He was a handy man, and though he had never seen a guillotine, the French officials had explained the principle to him. It was on his suggestion that they had ordered the execution to take place at Atimanoo instead of at Papeete. The scene of the crime, Schemmer had argued, was the best possible place for the punishment, and, in addition, it would have a salutary influence upon the 500 Chinagos on the plantation. Schemmer had also volunteered to act as executioner, and in that capacity he was now on the scaffold, experimenting with the instrument he had made. A banana tree of the size and consistency of a man's neck lay under the guillotine. Ah Cho watched with fascinated eyes. The German, turning a small crank, hoisted the blade to the top of the little derrick he had rigged. A jerk on a stout piece of cord loosed the blade, and it dropped with a flash, neatly severing the banana trunk.
"How does it work?"
The sergeant, coming out on top of the scaffold, had asked the question.
"Beautifully,"
was Schemmer's exultant answer.
"Let me show you."
Again he turned the crank that hoisted the blade, jerked the cord, and sent the blade crashing down on the soft tree. But this time it went no more than 2/3 of the way through. The sergeant scowled.
"That will not serve,"
he said. Schemmer wiped the sweat from his forehead.
"What it needs is more weight,"
he announced. Walking up to the edge of the scaffold, he called his orders to the blacksmith for a 25-pound piece of iron. As he stooped over to attach the iron to the broad top of the blade, Ah Cho glanced at the sergeant and saw his opportunity.
"The honorable judge said that Ah Chow was to have his head cut off," he began.
The sergeant nodded impatiently. He was thinking of the 15-mile ride before him that afternoon to the windward side of the island, and of Bertha, the pretty half-caste daughter of Lafiere, the pearl trader, who was waiting for him at the end of it.
"Well, I am not Ah Chow. I am Ah Cho. The honorable jailer has made a mistake. Ah Chow is a tall man, and you see I am short."
The sergeant looked at him hastily and saw the mistake.
"Schemmer," he called imperatively, "come here."
The German grunted, but remained bent over his task till the chunk of iron was lashed to his satisfaction.
"Is your Chinago ready?" he demanded.
"Look at him," was the answer. "Is he the Chinago?"
Schemmer was surprised. He swore tersely for a few seconds and looked regretfully across at the thing he had made with his own hands and which he was eager to see work.
"Look here," he said finally. "We can't postpone this affair. I've lost 3 hours' work already out of those 500 Chinagos. I can't afford to lose it all over again for the right man. Let's put the performance through just the same. It is only a Chinago."
The sergeant remembered the long ride before him and the pearl trader's daughter, and debated with himself.
"They will blame it on Cruchot if it is discovered," the German urged. "But there's little chance of its being discovered. Ah Chow won't give it away at any rate."
"The blame won't lie with Cruchot anyway," the sergeant said. "It must have been the jailer's mistake."
"Then let's go on with it. They can't blame us. Who can tell one Chinago from another? We can say that we merely carried out instructions with the Chinago that was turned over to us. Besides, I really can't take all those coolies a second time away from their labor."
They spoke in French, and Ah Cho, who did not understand a word of it, nevertheless knew that they were determining his destiny. He knew also that the decision rested with the sergeant, and he hung upon that official's lips.
"All right," announced the sergeant. "Go ahead with it. He is only a Chinago."
"I'm going to try it once more, just to make sure."
Schemmer moved the banana trunk forward under the knife, which he had hoisted to the top of the derrick. Ah Cho tried to remember the maxims from the Tract of the Quiet Way. "Live in concord" came to him, but it was not applicable. He was not going to live. He was about to die. No, that would not do. "Forgive malice." Yes, but there was no malice to forgive. Schemmer and the rest were doing this thing without malice. It was to them merely a piece of work that had to be done, just as clearing the jungle, ditching the water, and planting cotton were pieces of work that had to be done. Schemmer jerked the cord, and Ah Cho forgot the Tract of the Quiet Way. The knife shot down with a thud, making a clean slice of the tree.
"Beautiful!" exclaimed the sergeant, pausing in the act of lighting a cigarette. "Beautiful, my friend."
Schemmer was pleased at the praise.
"Come on, Ah Chow," he said in the Tahitian tongue.
"But I am not Ah Chow,"
Ah Cho began.
"Shut up," was the answer. "If you open your mouth again, I'll break your head."
The overseer threatened him with a clenched fist, and he remained silent. What was the good of protesting? These foreign devils always had their way. He allowed himself to be lashed to the vertical board that was the size of his body. Schemmer drew the buckles tight, so tight that the straps cut into his flesh and hurt. But he did not complain. The hurt would not last long. He felt the board tilting over in the air toward the horizontal and closed his eyes. And in that moment he caught a last glimpse of his garden of meditation and repose. It seemed to him that he sat in the garden. A cool wind was blowing, and the bells in the several trees were tinkling softly. Also birds were making sleepy noises, and from beyond the high wall came the subdued sound of village life. Then he was aware that the board had come to rest, and from muscular pressures and tensions he knew that he was lying on his back. He opened his eyes. Straight above him he saw the suspended knife blazing in the sunshine. He saw the weight which had been added, and noted that one of Schemmer's knots had slipped. Then he heard the sergeant's voice in sharp command. Ah Cho closed his eyes hastily. He did not want to see that knife descend, but he felt it for one great fleeting instant. And in that instant he remembered Cruchot and what Cruchot had said. But Cruchot was wrong. The knife did not tickle. That much he knew before he ceased to know. End of section 6, read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California, shaggybark.blogspot.com.